Hey guys, today I'm going to share a lecture that I really enjoyed. It's about 9 years old, and I've listened to it several times over the years, but I recently re-listened to it, and it is amazing how much more relevant this all seems in this current climate of lockdowns and government control and all of that such. The contrast to the natural childhood is amazingly stark, and I think it would benefit us all to know more about healthy versions of childhood and play, and so we can adapt this into our world and make our world a little bit better. This is a little bit off topic for my channel, but I find it very important, and I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture.
So, without further ado, Dr. Peter Price.
So the title of my talk is Free to Learn, How Children Educate Themselves Through Play. I am an evolutionary psychologist. That means that I am interested in human nature, and I am interested in how human nature came about through natural selection, and I'm particularly interested in the nature of human children. Why children are the way they are. Why are they so playful? Why are they so curious? Why are they the way they are? And the answer to that question, the short answer to that question is that they are the way they are because that's how they educate themselves. That we are the species that has to become educated. We took a track long ago evolutionarily in which we became the animal that has to educate itself. We can't survive without acquiring the knowledge and skills and values of the previous generation, and that's what I define as education. And throughout most of human history, until very, very, very recent times from a biological point of view, that education was always done by children themselves. There was never any concept that adults educate children. Children always educated themselves. So that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about, the idea that children are designed by natural selection to educate themselves, and that they do it largely through play. The reason children want to play all the time is because their biology, every neuron in their body is telling them that that's what they need to do in order to become educated people. So the first person to develop a theory of play similar to the one that I've been working on was a philosopher and naturalist named Carl Brooks. Not too long after Darwin's Origin of Species, he began writing, applying Darwin's theory of natural selection to trying to understand play. He got interested in play. And in 1898, he published a book entitled The Play of Animals, in which he pointed out that the young of all mammals play. That observation has been verified by many animal researchers since. He pointed out that those animals that have the most to learn are the ones that play the most. And he pointed out that animals of any species play, when they're young, at the very kinds of skills that they most need to practice in order to survive. So whatever the primary bottleneck to survival is for a species, that's what the young will play. So young lions play at predation because they've got to be able to, that's difficult to do. And in order to survive, they've got to be able to capture game. And so young lions, everybody's seen kittens play at predation. Young zebra colts and young gazelles and other such creatures that are preyed upon by lions and such play at fleeing and dodging, because that's the big stumbling block to their survival, is getting away from the lions that are preying upon them. Young monkeys play at swinging around in trees, chasing one another around in trees. Whatever it is that animals have to do, that's what they play. He also pointed out that, as I said before, that those species of animals that have to learn the most play the most. So primates play more than non-primates. Carnivores play more than herbivores because they really have to learn a lot in order to be successful carnivores. So he developed what is called the practice theory of play. That the purpose of play is to practice the skills that are needed for survival. Then a few years later, in 1901, he published a second book called The Play of Man, in which he applied the same idea to human play. And his argument there was, well, human beings, of course, are mammals. And isn't it interesting that human children, when they are free to play more than do the young of any other species. And in fact, humans will even play into adulthood, which is pretty rare for most other species of animals. So I fit his theory perfectly. Human beings are the species that have the most to learn. We have the fewest rigid instincts. We have the most to learn. And so our young play the most. He pointed out, in addition, that another difference between human beings and other animals, besides the fact that we have more to learn, is that what we have to learn depends in part upon what culture we grow up in. That there are certain species-specific behaviors that human beings need to practice no matter where they're growing. Walking on two legs, for example, running, jumping, climbing, some of those things that are similar to what animals learn. We have to learn to get along with one another no matter what culture we're learning. So we all play socially. We all play at physical things. We all play at those kinds of things. We also all play at language. Language is clearly learned through play. The earliest cooing and babbling of babies, if you ever watch it, is obviously play. And the first use of words are not to get anything. They're just playful use of words. So children are learning words. And this is true in every culture. But of course, the specific words they're using depend upon the culture in which they're growing up. But what Bruce pointed out in addition for human beings is that there's an add-on to this instinctive drive to play, and that's also an instinct to look around and pay attention to what are the skills that are important to learn in your culture, and then to incorporate that into your play. So young children growing up in different cultures will play at different things because they're observing different kinds of activities within the culture in which they're growing up. So that was basically Bruce's theory. Now, I've built upon Bruce's theory in a couple of ways. One way that I've built upon it is to look into the play of children in hunter-gatherer cultures. Now, I've never lived in a hunter-gatherer culture, but so my approach was, first of all, to read whatever I could that has been written by anthropologists who have lived in and observed hunter-gatherer cultures. And then secondly, to supplement that by conducting a survey a few years ago. One of my graduate students and I conducted a survey in which we identified 10 different fairly prominent anthropologists who among them had lived in 7 different hunter-gatherer cultures on 3 different continents, some in tropical areas, some in more temperate areas, some in deserts, some in jungles. So these were cultures in very different parts of the world. I should point out, first of all, that for almost all of our history, we were hunter-gatherers. Agriculture was developed a mere 10 or 11,000 years ago, which from a biological point of view is a speck of time. Very little biological evolution would have occurred during that time. So fundamentally, our evolution was as hunter-gatherers. The characteristics that distinguish us from other species of mammals would have come about during our hunter-gatherer days. Now, some groups of people have managed to survive as hunter-gatherers into modern times, certainly into the 20th century. And it was primarily during the last half of the 20th century that anthropologists began to really make serious contact with these groups and study these groups. And all in all, there are several dozen different groups of hunter-gatherer cultures that were made contact with, people that were surviving in relatively isolated parts of the world so that they had remained pretty much unaffected by modern times at the time that anthropologists began to make contact with them and observe them. Now, there are certain similarities among all of these cultures that have been studied. These are banned hunter-gatherer cultures, regardless of the differences in climate and geography and so on and so forth. Besides the fact that they all survived by hunting and gathering, they all also live in small bands of 20 to 50 people per band, counting children. The bands are mobile, so the people move around in these bands to follow the available game and vegetation, generally within a sort of circumscribed territory. The primary values of the people in every one of these cultures that has been studied are, number one, sharing and egalitarianism. The purpose of a band, the purpose of a hunter-gatherer band is so that people will share. Because to survive, you really need to share if you're a hunter-gatherer. So that's the primary ethical value, is sharing. And part of that ethical value of sharing is the concept of equality. So, and equality to people in a hunter-gatherer band means something different than the way we usually use the word equality. When we talk about equality, that's a high value in our democratic society, but it generally means equality of opportunity. To them, it really means equality of results. It means nobody would have more than anybody else. So sharing is crucial to their way of life. As part of their egalitarian view, they don't have leaders. There's no such thing as a chief. There's no such thing as a big man. In fact, big man is a slur. It's something you would call somebody who's grown too big for his pants, who's acting like a big shot. It's a way of putting somebody down. So there's no chief. Decisions are made by consensus in these groups. There might be a kind of nominal person who could be a woman. In some cases it's a woman, more often it's a man actually, who's kind of, just by virtue of living for a long time, being around, is seen as somebody who's a good moderator, good at helping work out compromises and so on and so forth. But that person has no more power than anybody else. Now, also as part of this egalitarian attitude is a very, very strong valuation for individual autonomy, individual freedom. Nobody in a hunter-gatherer band tells another person what to do. And that sounds almost odd in our culture. Aren't there bosses? Aren't there followers? You just don't tell anybody what to do. You're interested in what people are doing, but you don't feel like you have any right to control what they're doing. And most remarkable of all, they apply this to children. They don't tell children what to do. Even little children, they don't tell them. So let me give an example. Let me give some examples of that, just to give you some quotations about how this idea applies to children. Here are 4 different quotations, each from different anthropologists who observed a different hunter-gatherer band, just to give you an idea. And basically, these quotations could apply to any of the bands that were in our survey, and essentially all of the bands that have been discovered, all the different hunter-gatherer cultures that have been discovered. So here's one quotation. Hunter-gatherers do not give orders to their children. For example, no adult announces bedtime. At night, children remain around adults until they feel tired and fall asleep. Adults do not interfere with their children's lives. They never beat, scold, or behave aggressively with them, physically or verbally, nor do they offer praise or keep track of their development. The second, quite different. So it's not just that they don't punish them, they also don't praise them, and they don't keep track of their development. Here's another one. This is Yomi Goso, by the way, regard. She studies a group in the Amazon called Karakana, but she's writing here about hunter-gatherers in general. Here's another, a different quotation from a different person. The idea that this is my child or your child does not exist. Deciding what another person should do, no matter what his age, is outside the Yakwana vocabulary of behaviors. There is great interest in what everyone does, but no impulse to influence, let alone coerce anyone. The child's will is his motive force. So here's another one from yet a different anthropologist. Infants and young children are allowed to explore their environments to the limits of their physical capacities and with minimal interference from adults. Thus, if a child picks up a hazardous object, parents generally leave it to explore the dangers on its own. The child is presumed to know what it is doing. And I have one of my colleagues at Boston College spent many months living with a group called the FA in Africa, a hunter-gatherer group. And she's shown me films and slides of little toddlers playing with machetes and playing near the fire, adults sitting back paying no attention to this. And I asked her, well, do they get hurt? And she said, yeah, sometimes they get hurt. Sometimes they get cut, sometimes they get burned, and many of the adults have cuts and scars from when they were children. But they don't kill themselves, you know, and they get over it. And the general belief is that it's better to take the risk that somebody will get burned or cut than to quash their will. That's the belief of hunter-gatherer parents. So here's one more quotation. This one from Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, who wrote a wonderful book not long ago, a few years ago, called The Old Way. She was one of the first to observe a group in Africa that she calls the Chwansi. They're more often known as the Kong, and who have since, after her studies, they became kind of the most fully studied of hunter-gatherer groups. But she was studying them before they were kind of overrun by anthropologists. So she wrote here, children very rarely cry, probably because they have little to cry about. No child was ever yelled at or slapped or physically punished, and few were even scolded. Most never heard a discouraging word until they were approaching adolescence, and even then, the reprimand, if it really was a reprimand, was delivered in a soft voice. And Thomas went on to write in this same book, we are sometimes told that children who are treated so kindly become spoiled. But this is because those who hold that opinion have no idea how successful such measures can be. Free from frustration or anxiety, sunny and cooperative, the children were every parent's dream. No culture can ever have raised better, more intelligent, more likable, more confident children. Now, if Elizabeth Marshall Thomas were the only person writing in that way about the children, I would be suspicious. I would think she was looking through rose-colored glasses, or she had an agenda to present. But this is the way that all the anthropologists that I have interviewed talk about the children. They're just amazed by the intelligence of the children, the emotional intelligence of the children in particular, the social intelligence of the children. The fact that the children are not afraid of people, the fact that the children look you in the eye and that they aren't afraid to talk to you and that they are very confident and that they are not whiny. I once asked my friend, the one who studied the FA, what whining sounded like among the children. The reason I asked her is I'd given a talk someplace else, and one of the people in the audience was a graduate student that came up to me afterwards and said that I'm studying whining, and I believe that this universal theory of what whining sounds like. And do you know what whining sounds like in a hunter-gatherer culture? And I said, no, I don't, but let me ask my friend Jilda. And so I asked Jilda, and she had to stop, and she'd lived for months with the FA, and she said she had to stop and think, did I ever hear anybody whine? And she said, I never heard a child whine in all the time that I was studying them. So this is the typical kind of response that one gets when one talks about the children in hunter-gatherer cultures. So that's the first point then, is that children are treated in this remarkably indulgent, if you want to use that word, or trustful, if you want to use that word, way. A way that just in our culture sounds like you would just be terribly spoiling a child. I don't want to make the claim that we can absolutely fully translate the hunter-gatherer way of child rearing into our culture. I don't want to make that claim. But I do want to make the claim that here, apparently, for most, if most anthropologists do believe that these band hunter-gatherer societies do represent the way most human beings lived prior to agriculture. So for most of the time of human existence, this was the life of children. So the other point, the other conclusion I want to make from this, that came from my research into hunter-gatherer cultures, is this: that children in these cultures learn through their self-directed play and exploration. One of the questions that we asked in our survey of those 10 anthropologists who studied cultures was, how much time did young people have to play? And the answer that every one of them gave, in somewhat different words, was all the time, from dawn to dusk. From age 4, when they are regarded, that age 4 is regarded as the age of reason. A child has sense at age 4 in their view, generally speaking. Not that they would pinpoint it exactly, but their observation is typically by about age 4, children have enough sense that adults don't have to watch them. That they aren't going to go running off into the jungle all by themselves. They aren't going to get into terrible trouble. They're able to incorporate a sense of what the rules are of safety. They've learned enough to take care of themselves in a way so that they don't have to be watched. They can leave their moms, and they can now spend their time running with the other kids in these age-mixed groups of kids. From the age of 4 on through their mid-teenage years. Some people have this concept that way back when, you were grown up at age 12 or age 13 or age 14. That might have been true in some of the farming culture, but not true in hunter-gatherer cultures. You aren't grown up until you're maybe 18 or 19. You're still a kid. And you are still playing and exploring and you're learning until ultimately, essentially until the time that you're ready to have a kid yourself. And then you kind of are seen as one of the adults. So they are, the kids are playing. Just to give you a couple of the quotes in response to our question, how much time do they have to play? Both boys and girls had almost all day, every day, free to play. This was one of the responses. Another one, children were free to play nearly all the time. No one expected children to do serious work until they were in their late teens. That was Karen Endicott concerning a group called the Batak in Indonesia. But these were the kinds of responses we basically got from everybody. So then another question related to this is, what are children doing as they're playing? How do they play? What kinds of things do they play at was one of the questions we asked. And consistent with Carl Bruce's theory that I introduced the talk with, many of the answers that they gave were descriptions basically of mimicking of adult survival activities or cultural activities, music and artistic activities and dances that are important to the culture in which they were growing up. So here is just an example. Here's sort of a partial list of the things that came from this question of what did they play at. Digging up tubers, fishing, smoking porcupines out of holes, cooking, caring for infants, climbing trees, building vine ladders, building huts, using knives and other tools, making tools, carrying heavy loads, building rafts, making fires, defending against attacks from imaginary predators, imitating animals, which is a means of learning how to identify animals, making music, dancing, making musical instruments, storytelling, and arguing were all mentioned. In fact, it was surprising how often playful arguing was mentioned. Remember, this is a culture that makes its decisions by consensus. So the ability to argue well is very important. And it's also a culture in which everybody can hear the domestic squabbles next door because they're all it's like camping. And so they hear the arguments of husbands and wives, and this is a big part of the life that they're growing up with. And they know that to live a happy life, you have to know how to get your point across without offending the other person. And a number of the people that I talked to said that they hear the children off playing in some of these groups, the children make a little play village. They make small set of huts that kind of is a miniature mimicry of the actual camp that the group is living in, and they play out scenes that they have witnessed among the adults the night before, and they try to improve upon the arguments that they've heard. Not because any adult is assigning them to do this or suggesting that they do this. In fact, the adults, they generally do this out of earshot of the adults because they're often making fun of the adults when they do this. And so these are the ways that they play. All of the respondents said that the boys in the culture that they studied played endlessly at hunting and tracking. You have the ability to hunt large game with these little bows and arrows or little blowguns and darts that they use is just an incredibly complex ability. The anthropologists studying are just amazed that they can do this. Tracking is an enormously difficult skill. The skilled hunters are able to, just based on what looks like just a few bent blades of grass or a little dent in the sand, they can tell you what kind of animal this was, how long ago did it go by, how fast was it moving, was it male or female, and they could, or they could, you know, for example, if the track was crossed by the track of a little centipede that only moves about at a certain time of day, then they know that this antelope went by before them. There's a whole book called Tracking is the Origin of Science. There's an enormous amount of scientific thinking that goes into this. There's a lot you have to know, but in addition, you're constantly developing hypotheses based on these small clues. So the children are constantly practicing this, the boys in particular. But one of the groups that in our survey was the Agta, in which women as well as men hunt. And in that group, not surprisingly, the girls also played endlessly at hunting and tracking right along with the boys. So in hunter-gatherer cultures, adults do not deliberately educate their children. Instead, they give children lots of free time to play and explore, and thereby allow children to educate themselves. Now, of course, it goes without saying, I think, that adults are helpful. So if a child is making a little bow and arrow and wants some adult help to do it, any adult that child goes to, as well as any older kid will help. That's part of the ethic of sharing. You don't withhold knowledge, you don't withhold help when it's asked for. But the adult would not impose the help. The adult would not say, oh, let me make this bow and arrow for you because I could make a better one than you could make. Because that would be depriving the child of his opportunity to be in control of his or her own life. And that's the most important aspect of character of the hunter-gatherer person, is being in control of yourself. So now I want to turn to the question, so what? You know, this is all very well and good for hunter-gatherers. They educate themselves through their own free play and exploration. When I talk to my colleagues, they're not terribly surprised by this. But this does not immediately lead them to believe that this would be applicable today. I mean, after all, children in our culture maybe don't have to learn more than children in hunter-gatherer cultures. In fact, I think it's not hard to come to the conclusion that maybe hunter-gatherer children have to learn more than children in our culture do in order to survive. But what they do have to learn is different. Hunter-gatherer cultures, a lot of it is the same, but there's some differences, and among those differences are reading, writing, and arithmetic. Hunter-gatherer cultures don't, they are not literate groups, there's no written language, and they are not numeric for the most part. They don't even have number words in most of their languages beyond 1, 2, and many. So numbers are not part of the culture, arithmetic is not part of the culture, reading and writing is not part of the culture. Maybe one can't learn those things through the hunter-gatherer means. Maybe even if you're growing up in a culture with written words around you and with numbers around you, maybe you won't learn to read and write and do arithmetic unless you are required to do so, because this is a kind of foreign activity that wouldn't have been in existence during the most of human evolution. And in fact, one of my colleagues who's an evolutionary psychologist interested in education, in fact the other person besides me, we've had a couple of debates. He has written articles making exactly that claim, that this is why we need schools that deliberately teach reading and writing and arithmetic, because that was not natural to human beings. Let me tell you why I do not agree with that colleague of mine. And that comes really from my research at the Sudbury Valley School that this school is modeled after. And I have long been involved with the Sudbury Valley ever since as Jerry pointed out, ever since my son became a student there many years ago. I have been interested in the school, and I have tried to understand how education, approximately 140 students who are age 4 on through 18 or 19 years old, So this is similar to the kind of age range of hunter-gatherer kids who are out there playing in age-mixed groups away from adults. It has 10 adult staff members. It operates on a budget that is, per student budget, that is about half that of the local public schools and much less than that of the private schools in the area. So this is not elite education in the sense that it's expensive education. It's something you can clearly afford as a culture. The school, the main remarkable things about the school are the way it is administered and its educational philosophy. The school is administered as a democratic community. It's a participatory democracy. Every student at the school, whether they're age 4 or 13 or 18, and every staff member of whatever age has one vote at the school meeting. And the school meeting makes all of the important decisions of the school. All of the rules of behavior at the school are made through the school meeting. So, and the school operates in a very formal manner. This is not a place to just shoot off your emotions. This place, Sudbury Valley, it operates by Robert's Rules of Order. And if even when you're 4 years old, if you want to participate, you've got to follow Robert's Rules of Order. So this is a school very much, this is not like hunter-gatherers, this is a school very much in the tradition of American democracy. So the rules are made that way, and the rules are enforced by a judicial committee, which is modeled after the jury system in our larger culture. Except that in this case, the jury is chosen in such a way at any given time that there's always at least one little kid and one middle-sized kid and one big kid and one staff member on the judicial committee at any given point. So if you are accused of violating a rule, and you're at least as likely to be brought up by a student as you are by a staff member, and staff members might be brought up by students. These rules apply to everybody. And you would go before this judicial committee if you contest the situation, and then there might be something akin to a trial. Maybe witnesses would be brought in. This could be anything from littering to perceived bullying, anything that runs counter to a school rule. None of the rules in the school have anything to do with education. There's no rules at all about what you have to learn or study or anything like that. Basically, in this school, you can go, regardless of whatever age you are, you can go any place you want within the school buildings or the school grounds. Sudbury Valley has 10 acres of land. It has a pond. It's adjacent to a large wooded area, and kids at least beyond a certain age can go into the adjacent state forest and park. So there's no separation of children by age. There's no adults following kids around, keeping an eye on them, not even the 4-year-olds. I remember when I first learned about this school, and I said, and this was way back at a time in history when we trusted children more than we do today. Nevertheless, I said, what? 4 years old? You're not watching 4-year-olds? Didn't any of them drown in the pond? I honestly asked that. I was concerned about, don't they get lost in the woods? No. I mean, remarkably, this school has, if you were to look at, there's never been a serious injury. I mean, there's been hundreds and hundreds of kids through this school. 4-year-olds not watched, and they're not getting hurt. I mean, they might be getting hurt. I mean, they're scraping their knees, and they're falling out of tree branches and stuff like that. But they're not getting killed. They're not getting killed. Right? It's like those hunter-gatherer kids in a way where sometimes getting cuts and burns and so on and so forth. But for the most part, not even that. They remarkably, it's partly because it's age mixed, and the older kids are naturally, to some degree, looking out for the younger ones. And the younger ones are smart enough not to go wandering off too far away from the older ones. So at any rate, that's the way the school operates. So what about learning at this school? My very first study of the school, and as Jerry implied in the introduction, it was not a disinterested study because my own son had just started as a student. My very first study was a study of the graduates. Would my son be limiting his options by going to such a school? I started off by trying to get some professor of education to do such a study. This was not my field. I wasn't going to do it. I was studying rats and mice and brain hormone binding in the lab, and this was not my field. And so I knew some people in the School of Education at Boston College. I knew some over at Harvard, including some who said they were really interested in democratic education. But I could not interest them in going out to study with Sudbury Valley graduates. The more they learned about the school, the more it just seemed totally off the wall to them. It was off. They couldn't really fit it into their framework of thought, and they just were not interested in this study. So I ended up thinking, well, if anybody's going to do the study, I'll have to do it myself. So this was a long time ago. The school was smaller then. There were about 100 people, well, actually more like about 85 people, if I remember right, who had qualified as graduates of the school at that time, and that they had been at the school for a good number of years. They had left the school not to go on to other primary or secondary education, but to go on either into life or on to college. So they were essentially graduates. Some of them had gone through, most of them had gone through the formal graduation procedure at the school, which there is one. So we identified them, we were able to track down almost all of them, and almost all of them that we were able to find responded to our survey. And we asked them a variety of questions, including things like, did they go to college, and if they did, how did they get into college, and where did they go, and how did they do once they were in college, and if they didn't go to college, why didn't they, and all those kinds of questions. They are the typical kind of questions that a parent would want, that I wanted to know, you know. That I just wanted to make sure that if my son wanted to go to college, not that I was going to push him into college. But if he wanted, if that was his choice, I wanted to make sure that it was going to be possible. That was all. So, and lo and behold, I convinced myself that it was a good, a good half of the students were going right on to college, if not immediately, shortly after graduation. And those that didn't want to go to college were into interesting, good, productive lives and good careers. In fact, there didn't seem to be any particular relationship between how bright or intellectual a graduate seemed to be and whether or not they went to college. There was no view in this school that college is necessarily a good thing, and there was certainly no view among these graduates or among the staff at the school or the students at the school that you need to go to college in order to learn anything. You primarily would go to college if there was if you had sort of needed the college degree for a license, or if you were going into a kind of skilled area and you were going into maybe like nursing or something like that, where you would be going for a particular kind of training oriented towards a particular kind of career. So that study, which I published in the American Journal of Education a long time ago, convinced me that the school works as an educational institution. And then I got interested in the question of, well, how does it work? I mean, what are the kids actually doing there? And if you go there at any given time of day, they are just playing or hanging out, talking to one another. And some people go and they'll look and they'll see that and they'll think, oh, they're not doing anything. And some people will go and they'll look and say, wow, look at what they're doing. It depends on, it's in the eye of the perceiver. Do you look at kids and say, oh, they're just playing? Or do you look at kids and say, wow, they're playing? And when you look at what they're actually doing in their play, it's really quite remarkable. And I took the approach to the degree that I could of spending quite a bit of time at the school, and just kind of sitting at a distance close enough that I could kind of see what people were doing and overhear what they were saying, while pretending to read a book or a magazine or do my own thing, but I was really just spying on them what they were doing. And then I had a graduate student who did that in a very systematic way and did his doctoral dissertation, and we published a couple of articles based on our observations at the school, primarily based on the age-mix interactions and the value of age-mix play at this school. So So the school works as an educational institution in that, first of all, I should say everybody learns to read, but they learn to read at different ages. They don't all learn to read by the age of 6, although many of them do. A lot of them don't, at least at the time I did the study, didn't learn to read until they were considerably older, sometimes even as late as 11 or 12 or 13. but by the time they were 15, you couldn't tell any difference between those who had learned early and those who had learned late. There's clearly no critical period for learning to read. My son, who's now a staff member at the school, tells me that my study of reading, which actually some undergraduates of mine and I did many years ago, is obsolete, that a lot of the kids nowadays are learning, many more of the kids are learning to read and type earlier now than they did before, because so much computer play and they're communicating, texting, little kids are texting. So they are using the written word as a form of communication, which was not true in the past. And so they're picking up reading and typing much the way one picks up oral language in the context of communication. So that's, so the school works. Now here's what, we're now at kind of section D on this outline, the optimal context for self-education, how Sudbury Valley School is like a hunter-gatherer band. The school did not set itself up to emulate a hunter-gatherer band. It really, as I said, set itself up to be a democratic, participatory democracy. But in my opinion, as an evolutionary psychologist, the reason the school works so beautifully as an educational institution, as an institution for self-education, is it essentially is, for our time and place, a sort of hunter-gatherer band. It provides the environmental context that children need if they are going to educate themselves optimally. And I've listed 6 aspects of that environment here. The first is the social expectation and reality that education is children's responsibility. No hunter-gatherer child and no child at Sudbury Valley School has the belief that somebody else is in charge of their education. If you know that nobody else is doing it for you, then you better do it yourself. Then you take responsibility for yourself. It doesn't mean that it's consciously thought out that way, but somehow in your gut you sense, I am responsible for myself. So I need to assume that responsibility. I think children naturally assume that responsibility. Every 2-year-old, every 3-year-old, every 4-year-old is educating himself or herself all the time. But we, in our regular schools, take that responsibility away from the child and destroy, in a way, that sense of personal responsibility for my own education by virtue of really making it impossible for the child to use that self-educative drive. So the first part of the crucial part of the environment is not to take away the expectation that the child already naturally has that education is my own responsibility. That's number one. Number 2, unlimited freedom to play, explore, pursue one's own interests. That includes time to just do nothing, time to be bored, time to be bored and get over boredom. Danny Greenberg, who's one of the founders of the school and his primary philosopher, talks about boredom as the great stirrer of the soul. Never try to feel like if a child says he's bored that it's your job to get the child over boredom. Let the child be bored. Because it's boredom. Boredom is the state of mind that gets you into a state where I better figure something out here. I need to take control. And sometimes kids, especially kids who come from another school, and they are waiting and looking for somebody to tell them what to do, or somebody to tell them, hey, shouldn't get off your butt and start doing something, you know. They are the ones that constantly saying that I'm bored, and at the school, the staff just let them keep saying they're bored until they no longer can say. So unlimited freedom to plan for, not an hour per day, not 2 hours per day, not 5 hours per day, all the time to play in the school. The third characteristic was similar between the hunter-gatherer culture and hunter-gatherer band and Sudbury Valley Schools, opportunity to play with the real tools of the culture. So hunter-gatherer kids are playing with bows and arrows and knives and fire and dugout canoes and so on and so forth. That's how they learn to use them, and that's one reason why the adults allow them to use them. How else are they going to learn, they say to the anthropologist who says, why do you let your child play with this nut? So that's and at Sudbury Valley School, the kids are playing with the cooking equipment, they're playing with woodworking equipment, they're playing, of course, with computers. I mean, computers are the bow and arrow of our culture. They're the primary tool, and every child knows that this is the primary tool. And of course, children are going to be attracted to computers. Of course, children are going to learn more about computers than their parents learn, because that is the tool of the culture in which they are growing up, just as the bow and arrow was the tool of the culture in which the hunter-gatherer child was growing up, or the digging stick was the tool, or the dugout canoe was the tool. So children, and they need to play with these, not just be told how to use them in certain controlled ways, but to allow to really, in a metaphorical sense, turn them upside down and inside out and explore the guts of the thing and know how to do everything that you can, figure out new things to do with it. And children are doing that all the time. Fourth characteristic, access to a variety of caring adults who are helpers, not judges. The children in a hunter-gatherer band know that they can go to any of the adults. They're not limited to their own mother or their own father or their own. They can go to any of the adults in the band. They are all, most of them literally are uncles and aunts. So they're people that they know well. They're people who love them, and they are each people who have different personality characteristics, different knowledge. So depending on what you need, you would go to this person or to that person or to that person. And the same is true at Sudbury Valley. There's not one teacher there for a classroom of children. There are a number of staff members who are not, they don't call themselves teachers, they're not in a particular role, they're real people, they're not people who are just playing a particular kind of role. And each one has a different personality, they've got different skills, different knowledge, so the kids know that if you need a shoulder to cry on, you might go to this person, not that person. If you want to try out some intellectual argument that you've developed, you would go to that person and not this person, and so on and so forth. So that's really important. Children need to sense that there's a variety of people that they can go to. They can't be limited. Sometimes people talk about the mentoring concept, that a child needs a mentor, and I do not buy the mentoring concept, because that gives the notion that the child is growing up trying to emulate one particular person. I don't think that's what children want to do. They want to draw the best that they can from each person. And they also learn the negative things. Oh, I don't want to be like so-and-so on this aspect, So they're learning from negative examples as well as positive examples. Not just from the staff at the school, but also from the older kids at the school that they observe. So access to a variety of caring adults who are helpers, not judges. That is really key. Because to really trust an adult, to really go to an adult with a problem, to really ask for help, you can't feel like that adult is evaluating you. Because if the adult is evaluating you, then you have to put yourself into an impression management mode, not a mode of expressing ignorance. You have to be, when you're being evaluated, you fear failure. You want to be correct. When you're really learning, though, you've got to not fear failure. You've got to be able to say what you don't know. You've got to be able to be honest with the person you're talking to. And that's really impossible if that very person you're talking to is also your judge, is also evaluating you, giving you some kind of a report card, some kind of report. So it's crucial. Remember, I said hunter-gatherer adults don't keep track of children's development. They don't offer praise and they don't offer criticism. They're not in the business of evaluating. They're just there helping the kids if the kids ask for help. And that's just also true at a Sudbury school. That is oftentimes the hardest thing for people to understand when they approach such a school. Why is it that there's not at least some evaluation going on? Well, that would entirely change the relationship between the children and the staff members if the staff became evaluators rather than just pure friendly uncles and aunts who are helping them out when asked for it. So the fifth characteristic, free age mixing among children and adults, adolescents rather. This has been the focus of much of my own study, and as I mentioned before, one of my graduate students did his doctoral dissertation really on the value of age-mixed play. During all of human history, children always played in age-mixed groups. Age segregation, where you just 8-year-olds are playing with other 8-year-olds, is as an artifact of modern times, which is purely a result of our age-segregated school system. And then once we had age-segregated schooling, then we began to age-segregate kids in other contexts too. play evolved in a world in which it was never age segregated. Always it was age mixed. And age mixed play is very different from same age play. It's less competitive. Why would you care about winning? You know, if you're 8 years old and your playmate is 4 years old, or if you're 15 years old and your playmates are 7 and 8 year olds. What you care about is having fun, stretching your own skills, and helping that younger kid, not necessarily out of altruistic motives to help the other kid, but because to make the game fun, you've got to help the other kid, right? So you're playing a game that involves reading, you know, and the other kid can't read, so you have to read him the words, right? And so you're teaching him to read, but not because you care if he learns to read, but because you need to play that game. You're playing a game that involves, you know, you're out there climbing trees or you're scrambling up rocks, and one of your playmates can't quite make it, you give them a little boost up, and so you're constantly scaffolding the behavior of the younger kids. If you are one of the older or bigger kids or more skilled kids, in every aspect, whether it's scaffolding their social behavior, scaffolding their intellectual activity. Picture a game of cards where you've got, you know, you've got some 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds, but then you've also got some 6 and 7-year-olds. Now, 6 and 7-year-olds can't play a game of cards just with other 6 and 7-year-olds because they don't keep track of the, you know, even if they know the rules, they don't keep track of the rules, they show each other their cards, they don't pay attention. But when the 6 or 7-year-old is playing with the 13-year-old, the 13-year-old says, you know, attention, stupid, you know? And what is that, what is happening in this relationship? Actually, if you think of it, the skills in cards, just a simple game of cards, are really the skills that we call intelligence. Remember what cards were played. Paying attention. Pay attention to when it's your turn. Pay attention to what's out there. Don't lay down your card before you. Don't be so impulsive, you know. That is happening all the time in this kind of in simple age mixed game of cards. So, I mean, that's just an example. Age mixed play has built within it the capacity, the necessity, really, the necessity that younger kids are learning from older kids all the time. And older kids are learning how to be caring, how to be nurturing. They, in explaining things to the younger kids, are consolidating those things in their own mind. But most important, they're learning a sense of their own maturity. Even an 8-year-old interacting with a 5-year-old is mature, has a sense of, I'm a mature person. I can help another person. And what could be more important to learn than that is that you have the capacity to be helpful and nurturing to others. You often at Sudbury Valley see teenagers with little kids on their laps, reading books to them, or sometimes they're just doing teenage things and each one has a little 4-year-old on his lap or her lap. And the little kids are just so delighted to be there with these amazing bigger kids. But what's in it for the bigger kids? They are learning to be parents. You know, what could be a stronger drive if you're a teenager than the drive to start knowing how to take care of little kids, so that when you have a little kid of your own, it's not the first time you ever were dealing with a little kid. And yet in our culture, for the most part, people today are, at least many people are growing up never knowing how to take care of a kid until they've got one of their own. And that creates a lot of problems. So the value of age mixing goes clearly in both directions. And then the sixth characteristic, immersion in a stable, moral, democratic community. Human beings are designed to grow up in stable communities. We don't grow up wild in the sense of just out there alone or with people that don't have a culture. We have been cultural animals for long before agriculture was ever developed. So children in a hunter-gatherer band are growing up within a band that has certain values and rules and ways of being. It's a stable band. They know that they will be with these people for a long period of time. They know they develop then a sense of responsibility for the band and for others there. And Sudbury Valley is a similar kind of community for our time. Kids growing up in a Sudbury school, this is in a sense their band. They know that they're responsible not just for themselves, but for the community, the others in which they are they are growing up with. So I wanted to, I don't want to take too much more time because I'm going to leave time for questions, but I have as section E here, how children learn through play. And I just want to note that I've listed 4 categories here, which basically covers all of development. Play in the development of physical and manual skills, play in intellectual development, play in social moral development, play in emotional development. I've already talked a little bit about play and physical and manual skills and play and intellectual development. Now there's a lot more that each one of these could be a whole lecture in itself. But so let me skip to play and social moral development. Let me talk a little bit about how free play. By the way, when I use the word play, I always mean what some people might call free play. But to me, if it's not free, it's not play. But free play is play that is chosen by the players and directed by the players. So if there's an adult authority figure who is telling the kids what to do, or is solving the problems for the kids as they're playing, then it's not play. Then it's not play by my definition. So Little League or adult-directed soccer is not play, because it's an adult activity. It's the adult control. The adults might be playing. They're the ones who are, but the kids are pawns in this. Right? They're being told what to do. They're the toys. They are being told what to do in this play. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing, and many kids like this, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing to do, but let's not confuse it with play. Play is like a pickup game where the kids are getting together, they are choosing the sides, they are making up the rules, they are arguing about whether to strike or ball, and there's no umpire to decide it for them. They are figuring out what to do constantly. Now, in the Little League game of baseball, the kids might be learning baseball, but they aren't learning how to solve problems, they're not learning how to negotiate, they're not learning how to take initiative, and most of all, they're not learning how to please their playmates. The most important skill in real play is to see this activity not just from your own eyes, but from the eyes of your playmate as well. Because if you don't, your playmate will quit. So when you are playing, because the most basic freedom in play is freedom to quit. If you can't easily quit, it's not play. So you and I are playing a game. You and I are playing a game, and I begin to dominate. I begin to tell you what to do. And I'm not paying attention to the fact that you are getting more and more unhappy. And at some point you just say, oh, I'm sorry, it's dinner time, I've got to go home. And I am left without any playmate. I mean, even if it's a larger game, if I begin to dominate, the other players will just leave. So the essence of play, of social play, is that you've got to be able to be attuned to the needs of your playmate. This is true whether you're a 4 or 5-year-old playing a game of house with other 4 and 5-year-olds, or playing superheroes or whatever. If you begin to dominate or hurt the other person, and there's no adult there to settle it, that's really important, because if there's an adult there to settle it, that spoils it. But if there's no adult there to settle it, then you've got to figure out how not to do this, or your playmates will leave. And that is the ultimate punishment, because you want to play. There's nothing, every part of the child's body says, I want to play with these other kids. And the ultimate punishment, and the proper punishment, is that they leave him if he doesn't play, if he's bullying or dominating and so forth. So that is really nature's way of teaching human beings the most important skill that human beings have to learn. Way more important than learning how to read or write or do numbers, is learning how to see things from another person's point of view. You cannot have a happy marriage if you can't do that. You cannot have a happy relationship with your coworkers if you can't do that. You can't have friends in life if you can't do that. And if you can't have those things, you cannot have a happy life. You can have a happy life without knowing how to read and write and do arithmetic. But you can't have a happy life without knowing how to read another person's mind. Get into that other person's mind and know what that other person needs, so that you can provide those needs for that other person, while that other person is also providing your needs. And that is constantly practiced by children in play. So when we deprive children of play, which we are increasingly doing in our society, we are depriving of the opportunity to learn this most essential social skill. There's no way this can be taught. There's no way this can be taught by a lecture. There's no instruction that can be given. There's absolutely no substitute for play, for social play, for learning this skill. Now, another thing that children are constantly practicing in play is how to control their emotions. Children play at dangerous things when they're free. They climb trees too high. They swing, little kids will swing higher than their parents wish they would when they're swinging in the swing. And bigger kids will dive off of cliffs. They'll do all these dangerous looking things. Why do they do these dangerous things? It turns out young mammals do the same thing. Monkeys will swing from branch to branch high enough up and far enough apart that they don't always make it, but low enough that they won't kill themselves if they fall. They'll bruise a knee or something like that. And goat kids are jumping around on near cliffs and leaping high in the air in a way that makes it hard for them to land. Why do they do these dangerous looking things? It would seem like natural selection would weed such behavior out because it's risky. The theory that animal behaviorists have developed is what's called the emotion regulation theory of play. That what these young animals are doing is they are deliberately dosing themselves with fear. Because it's important to know how to react when a real fearful situation strikes so you don't panic, so you don't freeze up. You know how to handle fear. So you're constantly putting yourself in moderately fearful situations that you know you can handle, but barely can handle, as a way of stretching your ability to deal with fear. Children do this all the time as well as young animals, and children are also often putting themselves in anger-inducing situations in play, and I would imagine that young animals are too. So when they're playfully fighting, they sometimes actually get mad at one another. And it has the potential of turning into a real fight. But if it does, if they can't control that anger, just as I said before, the play ends. So they don't want the play. So children are learning to control their anger. I feel anger, but I also want to play, so I get over this anger in order to continue playing. So it's interesting that people who study play in animals have done what they call play deprivation experiments. There are ways to raise young monkeys and young rats in such a way that they have other social experiences, but they don't have any social play. They are even exposed to other young monkeys and rats, but not to playful ones. There's certain drugs you can give them that knock out the play drive. So here's a young animal that's only exposed to non-playful other young animals and to adults who are not playing. And when they grow up and you test them in moderately fearful situations, a situation that a normal rat or a normal monkey would respond with some fear, but then they get over it, these animals don't get over that fear. They freeze in the corner and defecate, and they don't begin to explore. And if you put them if you pair them with a stranger of their own species, they might lash out uncontrollably or alternate between freezing, acting fearful, and acting aggression. They don't know how to regulate their strong emotions of fear and aggression. Now, I want to conclude this talk by pointing out that over the past 50 years, we, as a culture, have been conducting a play deprivation experiment with our children. We have, over time, been increasingly depriving them of the opportunity to play. Howard Chudakoff, who wrote a book called The History of Play in America, pointed out that the first half of the 20th century, roughly up until about 1955, he puts it out, was the golden age of children's play in America. By about 1900, the need for child labor had decreased enough that children had a good deal of free time. Schools began to become compulsory, but they were not the big thing that they later became. So children had a lot of free time, and adults had not learned how to take control of children's free time yet. So children were out there in age-mixed gangs, playing with other kids. I grew up at the tail end of Chudakoff's golden age of play, so I can talk about that from first-hand experience. From the age of 5 on, I was pretty much free to go anywhere in town, and I was playing with kids all the time, after school, all summer long. We at some point did have Little League, but it was a minor part of our existence. Adults did not know where we were or what we were doing, and did not want to know. All they wanted was us out of the house. It's very different culture from today, and this was true across social classes. There was no class of people that were uptight, all worried about their kids all the time. Now there's a lot of reasons for this change, not all of them bad reasons, but I just want to say that there's this huge shift in the culture. Now over this 50 or 60 year period, that there's been a continuous decline in children's freedom to play and a continuous increase in the degree to which children's lives are dominated by adults. There has been another dramatic change. And that is that there's been a dramatic and continuous increase in all sorts of childhood mental disorders. It's not just that we are seeing disorders that we didn't used to see because we didn't look for them or know how to measure them. Even by standard questionnaires, which have been given in unchanged forms over the decade, there has been an enormous increase in childhood mental disorders. So, for example, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory has been given since 1938, and major sections of it have been unchanged. And using those major sections, you can develop a scale of major depression for assessing the degree of depression in children, and there's a certain cutoff point where today the child would be considered probably suffering from what would be diagnosed as major depression. Looking at that cutoff point, there are now 8 times as many children suffering from major depression as there were in the 1950s or any time before the 1950s. And there's been a gradual increase. It's not that there was a sudden increase of symptoms. Using Taylor's Manifest Anxiety Scale, which has been used since the early 1950s, there's been a 5 to 8-fold increase in anxiety disorders in children. If you don't like questionnaire data, if you think maybe people are just responding differently to questionnaire, here's a hard, cold fact. Suicide rates among children aged 15 and under is now 4 times what it was in the 1950s. In other words, as we have deprived children continuously of play, we have induced more and more anxiety, depression, and even suicide in children. It's not that the world has gotten worse for everybody. Suicides among people in my age category have declined over this period. Suicides of middle-aged people has actually declined a little bit too, or stayed relatively even. But suicides for children have increased tremendously over this time. We have whole new categories of disorders, ADHD and so on and so forth, that we never used to feel we needed to talk about. There's various reasons for that, and among which we are now calling something disorder that used to be called just normal kids being kids. But in addition, it's quite possible that there is more impulsiveness, because as I said, one of the ways you learn how to control your impulses is in play. And if we're not letting kids play, they're not learning how to control their impulses. That's the natural way. You certainly don't learn how to control your impulses when adults are making you do this or that, and every bone in your body says they want to do something different from that. So that's, I'm going to bring the talk to a close at this point, and I thank you very much for your attention. If anybody has to leave, please feel free to. Don't hesitate at all, but I'm glad to stay and address any questions.
Peter did say he will take questions, and also I want you to know River Road Books has been kind enough to get lots of copies of his book, and he has generously agreed to stay and personally sign for anyone who would like it.
So any questions? Yes.
There was phase 3 observations my kids went to this doctor D for OPS, and Dr. He's very famous, and he said the hearing eyesight rate in China used to be very high.
Yes.
And in here it was very low, but
Right.
nowadays it's catching up because I think
That's
the
exactly
outside-
right. It's very interesting to know that we have been trying to emulate the Asian school system ever since about 1980. This big report about how bad the schools were and how great the schools in Japan and then China are, and we began to try to emulate the Chinese schools. But we really didn't look at the data that the Chinese kids were suffering all the kinds of disorders that we are now suffering. They were ahead of us. They did this experiment ahead of us. The only result we looked at was the test scores. And so we felt like China and Japan and South Korea and now Singapore, that these countries are all burying us because so we're going to fall. We're a nation at risk was the word used in the 1980s for this, because these other countries are. Well, there's actually a book by a Chinese American who grew up in Chinese schools. His name is Yang Shen, I think it is. A book called Falling Behind, or Catching Up or Falling Behind, in which he points out at the same time that we began trying to emulate the Chinese schools, the Chinese schools were realizing that their schools weren't working. And they began sending people over to America. They said, why is it that the Americans are winning all the Nobel Prizes? Why is it that the Americans have all these entrepreneurs? Why is it that we get these high test scores, but nobody ever invents anything? Nobody ever, why is it that that all happens? And they began to think, because we're quashing kids' creativity, and they also began to get very concerned about the high degree of suicide and mental disorders among children. And so they have had difficulty changing their school system for a variety of reasons. Part of it is they still have this stupid task that you need in order to get on to college. And most parents in China, especially now that there's one child per family, believe that the only way to social mobility is to get their kid into college, and that's also their social security, because that kid who gets into college is then going to support them. So everything goes into teaching that kid what he needs to know to get a high score on that test. According to this author, I don't remember what the word is, but he says there's a term in China now that's more and more used to refer to the whole cohort of kids who are graduating from school, which basically means good at tests and not good at anything else. Because they're spending all their time just memorizing stuff for these tests, they're never doing anything. And then they get out into the work world and they don't know how to do it. And he also talks about a study that was done in one province in China where they followed up, they identified the top tests, the kids who got the top test scores, and they looked at what their life was like afterwards. And their life was actually significantly worse in terms of income, in terms of future career, than the ones who scored lower on tests. So the Chinese, the South Koreans, the Japanese are all recognizing that the very school system that we've been trying to emulate is failing. Yes.
I'm curious to know what you would say to, so if you look at the Finnish school system where children go to school until they're 7 years old, in Italy there are schools that are very much involved with this creative kind of child and letting the children use their imagination to propel play and to learn from one another, multi-age classrooms. And then we have the American system that has only moved further and further towards standardized testing, worksheets, sitting at a desk and being quiet all day. But so many people are forced into that system, even when there are alternatives available. So what would you say to parents whose children have to go to public schools, children who are going to be forced into this model that clearly doesn't work, and more so into the standardized testing? What can we do in the homes? What can we do after 3 o'clock?
I think that's a very good question. I think, aside from concern about, aside from the question of getting your, if for whatever reason you either cannot or will not remove your child from the public school system, and even if you can do that, there may still be a problem. We are a culture in which, in most neighborhoods, not all neighborhoods, but in most neighborhoods, kids can't just go outside and find other kids to play.
Right.
And it used to be, and there's a lot of reasons for that. and I don't want to say it's all, but I don't want to say it's all because of the, but one of the reasons is the fact that schooling takes more and more of people's time. So kids are doing homework when they have to do homework. There's, God forbid, summer reading lists, all this kind of stuff. Parents are supposed to monitor their kids' homework, so the home becomes a place, an extension of school. All of these things have occurred. The school mentality has left the school walls so that we put kids into these structured activities. So that's part of it. There's also been a rise in fear that comes in part for maybe some valid reasons. There really is more traffic. There's not more crime, there's less crime. There's not more murders, there's fewer murders than there were then. But the idea that kids are going to be snatched away is largely what happens is whenever that does happen, any place in the developed world, we all hear about it, so we think it's much more common than it really is. But so there's these fears, but how do you overcome that? What do you do? And I think there's a number of things one can do. And one book I would recommend actually is a book called Playborhood, P-L-A, it's like neighborhood, but Playborhood, written by Mike Lanza, L-A-N-Z-A. And he undertook this problem for him when he moved into this sort of upper middle class neighborhood in California. And he found he had young kids, he now has 3 young boys, and there was nobody out there to play. I mean, there were all these nice lawns and nobody out there to play. So he took it upon himself to solve that problem. And the route he took was to put, when the kids were little, he put playground equipment in the front yard, not the backyard. He put the family picnic table in the front yard, not the backyard. He put out all kinds, he made this beautiful little basketball court in his front. He just made this a kid magnet, and he basically put up a please trespass. And so everybody got to know the Lanzas. And pretty soon the kids were all coming over to play. Pretty soon neighbors, because the parents didn't get to know one another, the neighbors who didn't know one another got to know one another, realized none of them were child molesters, lo and behold. So after a while, it became like an old-fashioned neighborhood. It even got people to begin to take down their fences in the backyard and their hedges so kids could run across yards and that kind of thing. He gives that example. He also gives for 7 other examples in very different places, including the inner city, where parents took the initiative, who were concerned that their children had no safe place to play or kids to play with, outdoors, undirected by adults, took the initiative to figure out a way to do that. So he gives a lot of examples in that book of ways to do it. And there are other things one can do too, like you can, instead of going on a family vacation just with your family, go with a number of families. So you have adult companionship and you can let your kids run with the people they want to run with, which is other kids. There's a lot of things we can do. Another thing that we can do is act at the civic level. I mean, when I was a kid, it was very common in relatively small towns, if there was a park, for the town to hire, at almost no expense at all, a responsible teenager to be there at the park as a sort of supervisor. And so if somebody got hurt, so parents then felt it was okay, even for their little kids, the parents didn't have to be there. There was this responsible teenager, everybody knew who he was, who, if somebody really got hurt, would know what to do about it, and would call. Today it's even much easier because we've got cell phones, But that was, they just take steps like that. Get the local schools to open up the gymnasium and the playground after school and on weekends for free play, and maybe with a supervisor there, so the parents don't have to be there. So we don't have this awful thing that I see everywhere, where you walk around after school or on weekends, and the only place you find kids is they're in uniform, with coaches screaming at them from the sidelines, and their parents sitting there cheering them on. That is okay, but that's not play. That's not. The kids are not learning all those things that we learn in play in that situation. Yes, what about that?
With the modern technology, like kids love to play video games.
Yes.
And watching TV.
Right.
Like, are those considered play, or they're really should be?
Well, that's a good question. I think partly it depends on. Play is in large part an attitude. So one can watch TV like a zombie, you know, in which case it's not play, or one could watch TV in a really energized way and you're really getting something from the TV. Video games are clearly play, you know, but and many of them are social play. And they're, you know, the one thing you're not getting from video games is you're not getting physical exercise, and you're not getting outdoors and all of that. And you're not so much getting the direct physical contact with other people.
Or is social, real social.
But you often are getting a certain amount of social interaction, and for many kids, this is the only way they can get social interaction. If here you are home after school, there's nobody else outdoors to play with, or your parents won't let you go by yourself blocks and blocks away. So you get online, and you get online with your friends, or with other people, and you're playing this video game, and you're interacting with other people, and then you're talking about when you are together with them, or that one little free time you might have at school, you're talking with your friends about the game. Most of them are very social about the game. There's a lot of undue fears about video games. And at one point, because I was so often asked about video games, I looked into the research on it. And there have been a lot of people who've tried to prove harmful effects of video games. At first there was a whole bunch of people who wanted to show that playing violent video games induces violence in children. And they found zero evidence for it. Yeah. And, you know, when you're looking at any evidence of actual real violence, not surprising. I mean, you know, the kids know the difference. These are just cartoon characters. These are just characters. It looks realistic. They know these are just images on a screen. This is not real. It's probably in some sense less real than we used to shoot one another with cap guns, you know.
But has there been evidence that's shown that it's not so much that it creates violent behavior, but that it desensitizes them to real violent behavior when they're exposed to?
Yeah, I don't know what it, I would want to, I've heard that statement, and I haven't found any of the evidence that it does, but let's suppose it does. What does it actually mean to desensitize to real violent behavior, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? You know, you certainly don't want to create somebody to be violent. You certainly don't want to create people to know how to, not know how to deal with a situation that is violent. In some sense, let's say you live in a violent culture. It might not be a bad idea to be sufficiently desensitized to violence that you are not absolutely thrown off kilter when you see violence, because otherwise you can't act adaptively to it. It's like I was talking about the exposure to dangers in order to know how to deal with the fear. Exposure to violence in this video form to know how to deal with real violence if it does occur, so you're not overwhelmed by emotion if it does occur. It's not necessarily a bad thing to be desensitized to it. Sometimes the implication is desensitized to it means you're going to be more violent, but there's zero evidence that kids playing video games become more violent. That at least is my reading of the data. Yeah.
So with bullying being such a big thing right now, and the world's answer, it seems like, is the parents to take charge and the parents to be more in the schools and the teachers to be more
Right.
on the kids. So that's completely opposite of what we're talking about.
That's exactly the opposite of what we should be doing, except that it's very hard to make that change at a certain point. If kids have been raised in a way that they haven't learned how to interact with other kids, and so the first time you put them out there with other kids, they start bullying one another. And then what do? You know, do you just let them work it out themselves, or do you deal with it? I mean, it takes some sensitivity to figure out how to do that. But the ultimate answer is to get back to a situation where kids from a very early age are playing and working these things out themselves. That doesn't mean the big bullying problems occur whenever you've got a situation where a group of people are trapped with another group of people, whether they're prisoners in prison, whether they are Chinese peasants stuck on the land because they're not allowed to move elsewhere, whether they are children in school who are not allowed to leave that situation. That is the situation where bullying can occur, because the natural response to bullying is to leave. One of the reasons hunter-gatherer cultures work so well and there's so little violence in the culture is hunter-gatherers, because they own no property, if you feel that you're put upon by others in your band, you just leave. You go to join another band, or you start your own band. So it's like a hunter-gatherer band is a little bit like a play group, in the sense that it's a group of people who have chosen to live together. And if somebody feels put upon, they can leave, and so everybody knows, I better treat these other people well, or they'll leave and I'll be stuck with no band. Well, the same thing with kids playing. But if you force the kids together, they're stuck there at recess. They're not allowed to leave one another. That is the prime situation for bullying, and there's no recourse for it. So the natural situation is where kids are free to move and play, they're free to choose the kids that they're playing with, and so at Sudbury Valley, if the kids are, Sudbury Valley has a lot of rules, so there's a lot of reasons why bullying doesn't create Sudbury Valley, part of which is a very effective anti-bullying rule, and there's this whole ethos of tolerance for one another, but in addition to that, there's, if you just don't like the way one group of kids is treated, you go and play with other kids. Yeah.
I want to mention an article I read while ago, I think talking about a study they did 20 years ago in Japan. As the school getting more competitive,
Yes.
more stressful, actually there are more bullying happening.
More bullying, not at all surprised.
Right, and I heard the same thing, like in, I think, Hongdale, in Indian Hill School, which is 4th grade to 6th grade, there are more bullying happening than the
Right.
village school, because more.
Right. The other great factor that plays a role in bullying is age segregation. When kids are all the same age, they get into a competitive mode. And little kids tend to be pacifiers of bigger kids. When little kids are around, bigger kids behave better than when there's no little kids around. It sort of brings out the nurturing instinct. And that generalizes to your peers as well as to the little kids. There's actually a study done in Canada. It's a program called the Roots of Empathy program, and it started off as a means of trying to teach children at the middle school level about being parents, what it's like to be a parent. Initially, it was being used as a measure to try to teach girls not to get pregnant until later on. So they would bring a baby into the classroom, and the children would all observe this baby and talk about the baby. And the mother would come with the baby, be a newborn baby, and then every few weeks the mother would come again with the baby, just talk about the baby. And a side observation made by the teachers is that bullying decreased, not just when the baby was there, but even between baby visits. And then a researcher began to do a study that systematically tested that. It still hasn't been published, so I can't swear by it, but supposedly it's in press, in which they documented the decline in bullying and increase in kindness among the children in the condition where this baby was being brought to it. So what a small manipulation, just having a baby present once in a while brings out, they gave us one example, a kid who was this tough kid who'd been held back several times, and he was regarded as a real juvenile delinquent, and he just melted by it when that baby was there. He began to cry, and he at some point began to say, is it too late for me to learn how to be a kind father? And so on. And so in some cases it was just very dramatic. So, and the Sudbury Valley, you've got little kids present, and you can oftentimes hear older kids say, oh, they'll even correct one another's language. Don't use the F word because there's little kids here. Even in that one. Yeah.
I'm going to ask to take 3 more questions. 1, 2, 3, the hands I've seen up. And then if you have private questions, because I know there are people that are dying to have Dr. Gray sign their book, and we can't keep him up too late. He is the keynote speaker at the Arrow Conference on Long Island this weekend, which is a major alternative education conference. And we've got to have him in good shape to speak there. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Thank you. Over here.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you heard of this, I think it was a study or a book a teacher wrote on a study she did where she made a rule in her school, of middle school, of you can't say you can't play.
Uh-huh.
And I heard this on the radio recently, and I was listening to it, and being a parent of a Sudbury child, I thought that was the most bizarre thing, because they were forcing these kids.
Exactly.
And it was almost like trying to remedy something that they completely ruined anyway. But
Right.
I was very curious to see how that, how
Right.
those kids are ending up, because I think it's been going on for several years,
Right.
maybe a decade or
Right.
two. I don't know if you've heard.
I have heard of it, and I had exactly the same reaction to it. I don't know much about the study, but
Yeah.
in fact, I mean, that's exactly how kids learn. If I am not a good playmate,
Right.
I should expect to not be accepted. You know, and I'll look around. And one of the things that happens at Sudbury Valley is there will be new kids who will come who aren't very particularly good playmates, and they don't get easily accepted with the kids their own age. So what sometimes happens is they'll play with the much younger kids who will accept them as playmates, and they kind of learn the skills of playing with the much younger kids, and then they kind of move up the ladder to play with older kids. So it seems like it's almost like, you know, like a psychotherapist who is trying to figure out a manner of desensitizing their fears of other kids, and they would almost generate a program like that, but they generate that for themselves. Yeah.
So we don't live in an egalitarian society,
Right.
and there's only like, you know, a dozen egalitarian potential communities in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And there's definitely a adult world and a child's world in our culture. Do you have suggestions or examples of how a school or an unschooling family might integrate with the larger community in this dynamic of this adult world and child world?
You know, I think that happens all the time and naturally. You know, the kids are doing things, and the kids are, you know, first of all, they're adult staff members. The kids are, sometimes the kids do apprenticeships in the workplace. The kids are, I think, having a much actual, more of a realistic exposure to the real world, including the adult world, if they're in a Sudbury Valley setting than they are in school. And I think that maybe part of the evidence, and one way to look at it is to look at, based on my studies, what I could talk about is what the graduates of the school have actually gone on. How do they transition into the adult world? What do they do? You know, in many cases, they've really developed skills through their play, through finding their passion, but they then go on and get excellent jobs doing the very same thing that they were playing at. That sometimes where I thought you were going with this, but I don't think you were, was sometimes people talk about, you know, the real world out there is sort of this cutthroat competitive world. And if kids are not learning to be cutthroat competitive, how are they going to deal with the real world? But the truth of the matter is, I think the real world doesn't work so much that way. I think that the people who succeed in the real world are the people who know how to play. They're the people who know how to, you rise in the ranks by being valuable to other people. Not just, you know, just as you succeed in marriage, not by beating your wife, not the literal sense, but the figurative, not by winning arguments, but by virtue of learning how to understand that person, cooperate with that person. You also succeed in the work world. And a good CEO is the person who doesn't lord it over the others. It knows how to learn from everybody where everybody feels like this person is on my side. So I would argue that we often talk about the competitiveness of the real world, but I think sometimes we exaggerate that in reality we succeed by cooperating, and children that's, as I said before, I think that's the most important skill that people learn.
I'm very excited to announce my newest book, Everything the Government Does is Bad for Us. And you can get the paperback on Amazon for just $9.99, and you can find the video read-along version or the audiobook on my website, noticebooks.org. And definitely check out my book, Fake Diseases. It covers all of the major topics that come up, like birth defects, blood sugar problems, bone and joint problems, cancer, autoimmune problems, and more. And it's on Amazon for just $9.99. And the audiobook read-along version is free here on YouTube, and the link for that is in the description of this video. And all of my books, audiobooks, and links are available on my website, noticebooks.org. And if you want to see what is apparently my most controversial video that was banned from YouTube and BitChute, you can go to wagthedogtheory.com and view the whole uncensored version of the video. And I recommend downloading it if it is still there. And make sure to check out my channel for many other videos on a whole array of subjects, and my other channels are all in the description of this video.